Explaining the 7 Years' War. In 1748, the Austrian War of Succession would come to an end. This war had seen France and Prussia fighting against Britain and Austria. However, despite the fact that the war had ended, the treaty that ended the war had created more problems than the treaty had solved. First off, it would still leave North American land disputed. Because of this, when a few French colonists decided to build some forts along the Ohio Valley, the British colonists would retaliate. British troops, led by George Washington, would go to attack these forts in 1754. This event would begin the French and Indian War. Both French and British troops would land in North America, and with the help of native allies, they would assault each other's forts. Despite this, neither side would make much progress. However, despite the fact that both nations were attacking each other in North America, they were not formally at war with each other. In Europe, the old alliance between Austria and Britain was strained. At the end of the Austrian War of Succession, Britain forced the Austrians to recognize the Prussian conquest of Silesia. However, Silesia was the thing that the Austrians wanted to conquer. The British also saw the Austrians as weak and a nation that could not help them against the French. So, in early 1756, the British would sign a convention with the Prussians. The British would agree not to help the Austrians in a war to take back Silesia in exchange for Prussian protection over the British state of Hanover. So, in May of 1756, the Austrians, now without an ally, would rush over to the French. They also had an old alliance with Russia. All these new diplomatic relations came just before the French capture of British Minorca, starting a war between the French and the British. Frederick the Great of Prussia, now almost certain that the Austrians and the Russians were going to attack him, took the initiative and attacked Saxony, an Austrian ally, first. He would take Dresden, forcing Saxony to surrender, but would be unable to take Prague, and to make matters worse, Sweden would join the war against him. This would become known as the Pomeranian War. Sweden hoped to regain the provinces they had lost to Prussia during the century. To make matters even worse, the Russians would move west and capture East Prussia. Then the French would capture Hanover. In early 1758, Frederick would try achieving a quick victory against the Austrians by trying to take Moravia. However, his supply lines would be cut, and he would be forced to retreat to defend Prussia. Despite the fact that the Prussians were receiving quite a bit of financial aid from the British, their army would be decimated at the Battle of Kunersdorf. However, luckily for the Prussians, the Austrians and Russians would fail to pursue them, and would give them time to recover. On the other hand, their British ally had more success. In 1758, they were able to push the French out of Hanover, and they would also be able to assault the French at Senegal, in Africa. In 1759, they would destroy 2 French fleets, destroying the French's hopes of invading the British mainland. In North America, the British would capture Quebec during the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, marking a turning point for New France, what would eventually become modern-day Canada. They would also capture Montreal. In India, both the British and the French had been fighting in the Third Carnatic War. In 1761, the British would capture the important city of Pondicherry. Back in Europe, their ally Prussia was still suffering. At one point, the Austrians and Russians would even capture Berlin, and despite the fact that the Prussians took it back, this would only lead to mounting Prussian casualties. In France, the French economy was in ruins due to British blockades, but they were barely able to stay afloat due to Spanish loans. However, in 1762, the Spanish would enter the war on the side of the French. This, however, would lead to the British capturing Manila and Cuba. The Spanish would counterattack by attacking their bordering nation and Britain's ally, Portugal. Despite having a much smaller army, the Portuguese would be able to fend off the Spanish without any major battles, leading to this war being called the Fantastic War in Portugal. However, the war in Prussia was still going very badly, which led to them losing many strategic cities, such as their last Baltic port. Defeat seemed inevitable for the Prussians, and the British were pressuring them to accept concessions for peace. However, in January of 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia would die and be replaced with her nephew, Peter. Peter happened to be a great admirer of Prussia, and especially Frederick the Great, so would withdraw Russia from the war. In Prussia, this event would become known as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. And soon after, the Swedish, who hadn't done much in the war, would follow suit. The Austrians, who had failed to take Silesia, now had no support in the east, and the French were in no position to support them. Britain and Prussia were now ready to make peace, and in 1763 would open negotiations. The Prussians would gain control over Silesia, and the British would gain a great deal of territory from the French and the Spanish. The British would also be able to limit the French's involvement in India, allowing them to colonize it faster. In North America, the British would take French Canada, Spanish Florida, and a few Caribbean islands. They would also divide the territory of French Louisiana between them and the Spanish. In conclusion, the 7 Years' War was a very large war, which was sort of like a predecessor to World War I because it took place all over the globe. Despite getting a lot of land during the war, the British economy would be in ruins, forcing them to tax the colonies, and eventually leading to the American War of Independence. Thank you for watching this video on the 7 Years' War.